I think at the start it's a bit jarring because you forget that all of a sudden you are a bit of public property.
Is English in any way under threat?
I don't think so.
Those 18 and 19-year-olds in Kaikohe looking for ghost jobs are then going to have their support taken away from them. Is that fair?
Ultimately, who is the most accountable, most responsible for us and our whānau?
Tauhenare, Hekia Parata, Simon Bridges, Paula Bennett, Shane Reti. Who of them do you most strongly resonate with?
Oh gosh, it's a bit unfair because I worked for a couple of them, and they may well watch this interview, so I don't want to lose any friends along the way.
Tēnā koe, thank you so much for joining us today. Congratulations on your new roles, Minister for Hunting and Fishing, Minister for Youth, Associate Minister for Transport and Minister for the South Island. Being from Ngaitahu, does being Minister for Te Wai Pounamu, Minister for the South Island, make your role particularly special? I
think so. I think when I got the role, one of the first things I did was we had Waitangi at Akaroa, at Onuku Marae, and Justin and the team were pretty quick to point out that I was the first one to have held this role and to try and claim me, and to say that they'd be looking to me for a bit of leadership, I guess, in that space. So I think having come from that part of the world and getting the opportunity to represent that part of the world in Parliament and in government is pretty exciting.
I went back and watched your maiden speech. He nui te reo Māori ki roto i tō kauhau tuatahi. There was a lot of te reo Māori. It was beautiful to hear. What does te reo Māori mean to you, and why was it so important that you feathered it through your maiden speech? Well,
I don't speak it anywhere near as well as what a lot of people do, and in fact I speak it pretty rudimentary. I can understand a little bit, but not much at all. And I guess one of the things I wanted to do was reflect a little bit about my background and where I come from, but also, show people that if you try a little bit, I know we're all stressed for time, but if you try a little bit, you can weave it into important parts of your life. I wouldn't say that I use it every day or anywhere near as much as what maybe people would want me to or what I should, but I just thought I'd show a little bit about what is part of me and part of my history.
Did it make your dad proud?
I hope so. He's kind of a similar background to me, so he didn't get exposed to a lot of te reo growing up, like I guess probably a lot of people growing up in the 60s and 70s. I've never really spoken to him much about the main speech. He was up in the press gallery, or the gallery at the time, watching along. I think it was his first trip to the North Island, so he was probably more excited and surprised about North Islanders and what was going on. But yeah, I hope it made him proud. Since
the maiden speech, you've been part of a coalition making some very deliberate choices around language and treaty policy. Some New Zealanders feel quite upset about the reversal of decades of incremental progress in Māori legislation and recognition. Have any of those decisions been difficult for you personally?
I can understand why some people are questioning some of the decisions the government has made. I think when you analyse a lot of what's been going on, you can find sort of valid reasons why certain parts of the public or the population maybe thought things were changing too quickly or were changing without their ability to have a say on it. So that's been reflected in what the government's tried to do. I haven't necessarily found that difficult. My view has always been, I come from probably more of a background where if you want to do something to improve your life or to change something in your life or in your community, the best way to do that is to do that yourself. And so I think generations of people have shown that through language that's where the revitalisation has come. And I also acknowledge that the government has a role to play in that, but also the democratic process means you have to reflect what I guess people in the public are or their views on the development of language and whether or not things are moving too quickly and at a pace. And of course the irony is, if you go back a couple of hundred years, incoming governments pushed different languages on different people at a pace that was wrong to do back then as well. So I think there's a bit of a balance there.
You talk about a group of people who think it might have been moving too quickly. What do you mean by that?
I think probably this will be stereotypical, but it's probably a generation of New Zealanders who haven't been brought up with te reo Māori as much as many of us have and aren't as familiar with it. and don't understand why it's being integrated more into sort of everyday use, particularly when it comes to the news and broadcasts. But I think, I get that raised all the time in my electorate, and I always talk people through the fact that, I ask some questions around, if you were looking at language revitalisation in the UK, in Wales or in parts of Canada, what do they think about the fact that those parts of those countries celebrate some of their native languages? And they're actually quite encouraged and quite enthusiastic about it. And so then you translate that here, and that gives them reason to pause and think a little bit. So I think a lot of it is about just taking those people with you along the way, and maybe the pace of change for some people has been too quick.
Have you pandered to that group of people?
I don't think the National Party has pandered to that group of people. No, I think we've been pretty balanced on that.
Yeah, the coalition.
Well, I don't think it's pandering. I think it's reflecting the democratic processes. You've got to try and reflect the views of the people who have elected you. If those views are coming through quite strongly, they'll be implemented through in policy. And the same thing goes the other way, right? You've got equally strong views on perhaps the other side of the political spectrum, where there are groups who have been elected with the focus on maybe going more strongly on integrating Te Reo Māori in our everyday lives. And that's valid too, because they're reflecting the views of the people that elected them.
Currently there's a bill before the House to make English an official language. Is English in any way under threat?
I don't think so. I think the reason that's come through is it's part of the coalition agreement for one thing, and I think New Zealand First in particular have had a view that it needs to be recognised in statute at some point. And if that's what they want to pursue, then we'll support that as part of the coalition government. I think at the end of the day, that will mean a lot to some people. I don't think it'll change the functioning of everyday life much at all.
What will it change? What will it achieve?
Well, I think it'll calm some people's worries that English perhaps isn't an official language because it's not reflected in statute. Of course, it's used in all the statute books, and it's a sort of de facto language in New Zealand as well. So I think if sometimes passing legislation to make sure people aren't fearful of things going wrong, or to try and make sure that they've got confidence that their representatives are listening to them, is a good thing to do, whether or not it has wide sweeping impactful changes. You see that in a few other bits of legislation as well.
We're in a fuel crisis, people are just struggling to put kai on the table. Some would say momo taima, waste of time, passing legislation like that at a time like this. What are your thoughts? Do you support the bill?
Yeah, we support the bill. We'll be supporting it through. And I can understand those criticisms. There is a limited amount of time in the legislative timetable, and when you do one thing, you can't do another. But it's all about balancing priorities. And I think for people who are worried about the ongoing fuel crisis, they can have confidence that that is taking up most of our headspace. I've got the aviation portfolio, and not a day or an hour goes by where I'm not considering where our supply is at, what is price doing to the ability to travel around, what impact is that having on rural communities, in particular around my electorate. So people should have confidence that we are got our focus in the right area.
And what do you tell them when people are worried about the fuel in rural areas?
Yeah, I try and empathise with them first and foremost, because I think we've realised pretty quickly how reliant we are on fuel and the fact that all our fuel is imported to run pretty much everything in our everyday life. And I think now people are quickly realising not only is it about getting from A to B, it actually is an input into all our agricultural processes, a lot of our manufacturing, the production of plastics and goods, and even so far as to services. If you can't get to your job to work the cafe or stand on the slaughter board at the freezing works, then that impacts everyone down the line too. So I'm telling them that, trying to give them confidence that we are monitoring the situation as closely as we can. We're getting as much information in and getting that out as much as possible too, and trying to give people assurances that we've got good solid lines of supply. And obviously there is going to be some pain at the fuel pump in terms of price, and we're still yet to see that flow through into the price of goods, but that we have a response plan in place that when things change we can adapt and respond along the way.
When you entered politics, you spoke about being called a sellout, even in Uncle Tom. Those were your words, not mine. What was that like, the impact of somebody questioning who you were? Was that mamae?
I think at the start it's a bit jarring, because you forget that all of a sudden you are a bit of public property and people have an interest in you and your life and your background and what you do and say. The more you go on, the less it impacts you. And I think I reflect on that stuff, and it sort of reinforces my worldview that you can't put everyone in a box, and you can't say that just because you're from background X you believe in value Y. So it bothers me less and less now. I think it probably reflects more on the people who say those kind of things and their worldviews than anything I do.
At the time you said that that's the beauty of this position, that you're able to go out and meet people and learn things, get involved with your constituents, Ngāi Tahu as well. So a couple of years on, what have you learnt about being Ngāi Tahu?
It's probably a hard question to answer, because you can't pull yourself out of your own body and have much to compare it with. I think the benefit in this role is I've got to get to know a lot of different people from within, or both Ngāi Tahu, but within the different Papatipu Rūnaka, and up the top of the south as well. And so, I mean, the one thing I have always known, but it's reinforced to me, is that you cannot lump us all together. The way that they operate down in Murihiku down south is different to what we do in Arowhena, which is different to how they run up in Tuahuriri. So that's reinforced some of my main beliefs, which is that, you know, even at a Rūnaka level, there are differences. There are differences in values, there are differences in priorities, and you can't just label everyone with one broad brush.
How do you see the role of Ngāi Tahu within the South Island portfolio?
They were obviously incredibly influential, incredibly important to our economic growth and also to our social network. So they've got a massive part to play in being drivers of jobs and incomes and housing and tourism opportunities and food production. They, like many other significant players, need to have a seat at the table when it comes to engaging with decisions makers like me about where are we going right or wrong on regulations, how can they better use their land, what is the impact of government policy on their young people, for example. So I think they've got an incredibly influential role to play, and I think people should embrace that and encourage that.
Partners or stakeholders?
Both, it depends on the issue, right? So if you're talking at the core treaty settlement level, I mean, Ngāi Tahu and Tainui were the flag bearers in this space, and you've got to recognise the risk, I guess, they took in trying to lead that process. And all of those settlements have been legislated, and from memory, can't think of anything that wasn't passed unanimously. Now that is us as a parliament saying that we are agreeing and putting this into law and giving it the force of law as to what our rights and obligations now are. So at that treaty settlement level, certainly it's a partnership where the law requires. And then there will be other levels around engagement where different property rights or different interests are engaged, and you'll have different levels of engagement in the same way that you would have with a lot of other communities or neighbourhoods or individuals.
You, speaking about Te Tiriti and settlements, you're a lawyer, so you probably have a better understanding of Te Tiriti than lots of others. What does it mean to you personally, not just politically?
It's a hard one. I've never spent much time reflecting on it personally. I have generally taken a legal approach to a lot of things. I was a public lawyer, so I wasn't a treaty lawyer, so I won't pretend to be anywhere close to being an expert. But having to work in the public law space, you have to have an appreciation or acknowledgement about the role it plays in, I guess, the lawmaking process, but interpretation of statutes and everything like that. From a personal perspective, look, I'll be honest, it doesn't impact me on a day-to-day basis, really. I don't spend a lot of time reflecting on it or thinking about it. But that's just me and my background, and it'll be different for different people, and particularly from different parts of the country too, where the issue of the treaty and what it means is less settled than perhaps it is down in the South Island, where we've had sort of 30 years to develop a relationship with it, and the opportunities that come from settlement, albeit cents on a dollar, but the kind of opportunities that come from that. I recognise that that's not the same in other parts of the country, so I wouldn't pretend to speak for other parts of the country as well.
Do you believe it's a living document with ongoing obligations?
I can put my sort of lawyerly constitutional interpretation hat on. I'm not a big supporter in the idea of living documents. I think in general... Well,
if you use Ngāi Tahu settlement as an example, is it ongoing, the commitment?
Yes, the commitments in the settlement are. I think where I struggle is I prefer an interpretation of documents that look at what the people at the time were thinking and what they signed, and a plain reading of that document. To try and put 2026 values on a document that was signed in in 1840 can misskew what the purpose of that document might have been. Now, there are arguments that those foundational documents do need to evolve along the way, but I am interested in and I am convinced by the idea that when it comes to foundational documents that take on a constitutional nature, they shouldn't be changed rapidly and easily just because societal or cultural norms change. That if there is going to be a drastic reinterpretation of it, it needs to be done thoughtfully and carefully considered, and not just because a few people, whether they are legislators or members of the judiciary, think that they have an idea on what it means and therefore this is what it means now. I think at some point when you're looking at constitutional documents that are deliberately being locked in decades or hundreds of years ago, you've got to change those very carefully.
And I guess on the other hand, should constitutional documents like Te Tiriti or Waitangi be reformed, as the ACT Party wants to do?
Well, you'd have to delve into a discussion on what they were actually trying to achieve with their bill. I had the pleasure, or depending on how other people found the experience, the pain sometimes of chairing the Treaty Principles Bill. And I don't say pain because I didn't like the process, because I had a role to do as chair of the Justice Committee, but obviously it brought out a range of quite strong views in a number of people who directed those views back to me directly as the chair in not a particularly nice way, and that's not a pleasant experience. I think people have the right to challenge and try and change things, but in the same way that I think the genesis of that bill was a reaction to maybe 20 or 30 years of change that some people didn't like, trying to undo that overnight to a particular worldview of what that document means now is also necessarily not the right way of doing it. Where you find that balance, I'm not too sure, but I tend to stay away from ultimately leaving those decisions to people who are unelected and unaccountable. And if someone does need to make the decision, then I would prefer it to be, democratically elected representatives. Because at the end of the day, if we make the wrong decision, every 3 years we've got to go back up for our job and audition to you, the public. And if you think we haven't done a good job and we've made the wrong calls, you turf us out and you bring someone in who will make the right decisions.
Were you supportive of the Treaty Principles Bill?
We supported it through the first reading, and we didn't support it following that.
Personally?
Well,
if you had a personal choice, would you have supported that?
The funny thing is when you get into government, you kind of, from a conventional constitutional perspective, and I know this does sound like a cop-out, and in some sense it is, but you forego a lot of your personal views on a lot of issues because there's conventions around collective responsibility and collective decision making.
You still have a personal view, and lots of ministers share their own personal views.
Yeah, you do, and some of them do. Some of the more experienced ones who perhaps can walk that tightrope more cleverly than I can do. But there is an underlying constitutional convention that when you're in government and you're a member of the executive in particular, you abide by the decisions made by government. And I think one of the values that I hold is maintaining conventions as much as possible. I know there are some people that will challenge those conventions, and they can change over time. But I'm comfortable with that convention because it means that people can have confidence that the decisions being made by government are ones that are going to be agreed to by the democratically elected representatives. And again, if people don't like those decisions and they are members of a ministry or the government, then they can make the choice to no longer be members of the government if they don't want to agree with those decisions.
Ka pai. Let's talk about your portfolio, hunting and fishing. It's framed as recreation,
yes.
But it cuts across, conservation law, access, species management. What is the role of hunting and fishing? Is it about balancing the rights of all, or shifting power towards hunters and fishers?
It's a balance. It's not about shifting rights. I think it's about understanding more about the role, particularly in the hunting side of things, the role hunters can have in the conservation space in terms of hunter-led conservation, management of wild animals. In the fishing space, it's quite a constrained and narrow portfolio where it's really looking at the management of sports fish species in our waterways. A lot of the work the Fish and Game do is around advocacies and actually advocacy and improvement to waterways, water quality, wetland restoration, game bird management. So it is, I think you're right, it is that balanced space of being an advocate but also setting all the regulatory settings for what is essentially generally introduced species and the role they have in modern New Zealand and kind of the social or cultural importance that they have, because of course you might have a different view about pigs, for example, if you're on one end of the environmental or conservation spectrum, than you do if you're maybe living up in the far north and you're using it as a food resource. You might have a different view on to what extent they should be managed out in the wild.
There is a bill before the House at the moment. It's an Act bill wanting hunters to have a place on the Conservation Authority, which is, some people know it as a Conservation Board. Do you support that?
Yeah, I support the principle of that. I don't think that's been drawn, and so caucus would have to have a discussion. But in general, I think because the Conservation Authority has representation from different sectors at the moment, I think it's a fair argument to say, well, what is the sector that is missing in this piece that play a significant role in conservation?
Are they being excluded, hunters?
I don't think they're being excluded by not being specifically named, but they're certainly not being included in the way that some other groups or advocacy groups might be included. The question, I think, for that particular bill is, do you draw from a particular organisation, or is it a nomination from the Game Animal Council or the New Zealand Deer Stalkers? Because you've got representatives from, I believe, Forest and Bird and I think Mountain Safety Council and other organisations who get to put people forward. So I think there's a fair argument that if there's a part of the sector that's missing that play a significant role in conservation, that they could have a voice. I think it'd be a different question if there were no industry-specific positions to start with, and then you were trying to put a specific one on.
What would hunters, if they were to be on the board, what would they advocate for that they can't have now?
I think there are a couple of hunters, or certainly people from the hunting sector, who are on the board at the moment, not as of right, but because they have that position because they've been appointed by the Minister. I would think that they would advocate for recognising the role that hunters play in conservation. It's not just about going out there shooting a hind or something and bringing the meat off the land. They're going and checking traps along the way, they're doing ecological monitoring, they're undertaking widespread wild animal control. I think the purpose of that voice would be to say, well, how can hunters contribute? Because there's hundreds and thousands of people who go out recreational hunting. It's an asset that we as public can use for free, generally, and it can go a long way to increasing and improving our biodiversity. Just
switching to your Portae for Youth Minister, last week, on RNZ, there was a story that specifically looked at kaikohe. Around 6,000 people in the far north on the job seekers benefit. RNZ visited kaikohe last week. There were 15 jobs available. All the McDonald's jobs are gone, all the service stations, supermarkets. There are no jobs for youth at the moment. You've got the NEETS numbers up there, which are double, and then Māori on top of that are usually double the NEETS number. Using youth in the far north as an example, what can you do to change that trajectory for their lives? Yeah, it's pretty shocking, and I don't think anyone would say that any of those numbers are acceptable. I think the NEET rate's about 15% on average. I think for Māori it's 20, 21, Pacifica 24, 25. Those are pretty shocking numbers, and I don't think anyone should accept them. There's a couple of things you've got to do. One is the initial, emergency response, and that's where it falls to the likes of social development to provide accommodation support, job seeker support. But then where my role sits... But you guys are going to cut that. So at the end of the year you're going to cut support for 18 and 19-year-olds. So those 18 and 19-year-olds in kaikohe looking for ghost jobs are then going to have their support taken away from them if their parents earn over $65,000. Is that fair? Well, I think what we need to look at when we're talking about that situation is ultimately who is the most accountable, most responsible for us and our whānau and our families. And I think if we had a question as to who should be more accountable, more responsible for my children, is it me or is it you? I think most people would say I've got the number one responsibility. So that's all that's trying to... But you and our children would have better opportunity than someone from kaikohe. So it's not even the same starting game. Absolutely. So that's why that test is in place. It's an income threshold test for 18 and 19-year-olds. But at the same time, there will be 18 and 19-year-olds in families who are more than capable of supporting. So that, for example, would it be acceptable if I did have children one day and my children were 18 or 19 and I was earning, 6 figures, and then I said, no, even if you live in my house, you're going to be going and asking other people for support, right? So it's about how can we put as much of the responsibility and obligation on me first. You're earning late 200,000, you're talking about $65,000 a year. Is that fair? I think it is fair to ask families
to be the first port of call, then I think it's also fair to have a very robust welfare system in place. The thing that we don't want, there's a couple of things. One thing is having lived in a household that received that support, and I know my mother was very grateful for that support, but she worked her butt off every single day to try and make a good life for herself. We know that, and I know personally from experience, living that situation is no future for anyone. Now, there are always going to be people, through no fault of their own, who will have to ask for support from others, and I think it's the right thing to do to provide that support. But we do need to, as much as possible, use all tools available to get people off dependency and into work, because every statistic shows...
Did you ever go on the dole between your student loan?
No, I didn't. I was fortunate that I was able to find work most of my way through university, whether that was a cycle courier or managing bars or doing a bit of
I think
driving.
we all did. You and I both had mums that were on solo mums who were on the DPB at stages of our lives, but they had support. They had financial support. We're talking about 18 and 19-year-olds in Kaikohe with no job prospect, and you're going to take that money away from them with incomes that are only $65,000.
If their families can support them. Now, there is the test in place there. So no one is going to be left high and dry because there's no support available within their households, right? But I think going back to the crux of the initial issue is you deal with the situation now, that's all right. Part of my responsibility for the Ministry of Youth is how do we stop young people getting that situation in the first place? Now, there's all the wider economic stuff and growing jobs and incomes, and that's definitely part of the picture. But what targeted interventions can we do to make sure that we are keeping young people in school for as long as possible, that we're encouraging them to get some kind of education? Now, I am pretty agnostic when it comes to tertiary education. If you think you're going to have a better life going out and getting a trade or entering into the workforce or going to a polytech, you should pursue that. You should do what's best for you. But we've got to keep kids in school. We've got to get them into the workforce. Part of that is making sure the jobs are there. I get it. But we've
no jobs, no trades.
But what we can do
no polytechs up there,
is we can provide the support and the funding through the Ministry for Youth Development, partnering with NGOs and with philanthropic organisations to run driver licensing courses, to run chefing courses, to provide life skills, to help bridge that gap so that when opportunities do come up, that they are more readily available to take them.
Minister, National has a very long list of prominent Conservative Māori ministers. Early on, Sir Maui Pomare, Sir Apirana Ngata, more recently, Tau Henare, Hekia Parata, Simon Bridges, Paula Bennett, Shane Reti. Who of them do you most strongly resonate with, and why? Oh gosh, it's a bit unfair because I worked for a couple of them, and they may well watch this interview, so I don't want to lose any friends along the way. But look, I worked for Paula Bennett for quite a long time. She comes from a similar background as what my mum did. Her daughter's about the same age as me, so I resonated with her story along the way. And coming to Parliament, I never realised that I actually have two great grandfathers who were MPs themselves, and actually outside my second office, my photo hung on one wall, and directly opposite were them, opposite the other hall, Taiaroas and Parata. Wow. And they were Southern Māori, and I can't recall what party they stood for, but there has been a long tradition of Māori standing for centre-right parties, and I don't think that's unusual. And I kind of tried to make this point in my maiden speech, that people make these assumptions or stereotypes of, just because you grow up in a certain situation or you're Māori, you must believe X, Y, Z. Well, actually, if you think about what some of the underlying values are that some of my forebearers or some of those other politicians that you just read out, if they believe in you having more control over your own life, maybe a sense of tēnā ranga tiratanga or sovereignty over your own life, if they believe in reward for effort, or if they believe in strong communities, then you can find a place in centre-right politics. I mean, equally, I wouldn't then also stereotype and say, well, just because you're a farmer, you always vote National, right? You've got to make sure you treat everyone with respect and on their own values, and not take any of those views or votes for granted. Tēnā koe.